Welcome, everybody, to a new episode, or video, or whatever you want to call it these days. It's hard to tell. So, I guess I can start with the beginning of where all this started with this uncommon truth stuff that I've really been going into. And it started with a bit of unlearning. So, this is really something that's counterintuitive, but it's true. And so, one interesting thing that you may not know about knowledge in your brain and things like this is that there is in some ways a limited amount of space in your brain for knowledge. And I don't mean like there's a limited amount of space for it in like long-term sense. Well, there is in some ways. I think there's a little bit of a cluttering that can happen. But there's a limited amount of space when it comes to your awareness. There's a little amount of space that, like, imagine like you have awareness, right? And imagine that this awareness is only like a certain amount of space. Like, people talk about awareness as if it's like infinite space and this kind of thing. But it's not. It doesn't seem to be how it works in terms of how much you can actually become aware of and things like this. And while that sounds fine and nice in theory, but when you come in across reality, what you understand is that there is a limited amount of things you can become aware of. And you can see this if like if you're trying to remember like numbers or something and somebody keeps repeating numbers to you while you're remembering another set of numbers. It's going to be more difficult to remember those numbers. Another example of this is like sometimes I sit around the house wearing headphones, and if somebody's trying to talk to me, and I have even if I only have one ear, one headphone over my ear, one ear and another ear is free to listen, it's still hard to actually pay attention to what the person is saying. And we understand that kind of, but there's another level to this as well where the amount of knowledge that you can take in is actually very limited. At one time. And the amount of knowledge as well that you have taken in also sort of like plays a role in this somehow as well, because the way that like I learn things is through connections, right? So you learn about I don't know, just a simple example like astrology or whatever, and so you would learn about astrology, but you learn about it and then you like go like, oh, okay, so how would this make sense spirituality speaking? Like, people talk about like free will and all this stuff, and so the mind will bring up all kinds of other things as well that you've learned. And so what you have to actually learn how to do, and this is something that's counterintuitive because it's not commonly understood, is what you actually have to do is you have to unlearn. And this is not about like intentionally forgetting something, but actually more about like just going through your life as you would normally do, just not doing whatever it is that you're trying to unlearn. So say you're really serious about self-development, and you maybe decide one day to unlearn self-development or unlearn the ideas of self-development. What you'd have to do is you have to just go about your daily life, but just not focus on self-development and just do like normal people would do. And do that for like a couple of weeks or a couple of months or whatever. What you learn is like a lot of the things that you believed is probably wrong. And this is not a moral thing. This is not like, oh, you're wrong in some like absolute moral sense, like, oh, you're bad or you're guilty for believing this. No, it's like you're incorrect. Like the ideas were maybe too idealistic or maybe too simplistic or whatever. And so when you start unlearning things, you actually start to simplify, you actually start to practicalize what knowledge sticks in your head. Whatever knowledge sticks in your head is probably more accurate in some ways. Or at least it's a good starting point, right? And so you do this for like a couple of months. You unlearn like this for a couple of months, and then you come back, and you start looking at what's left, and you start asking like, okay, so what's here now? What's gone from what I remember? What was right? What was wrong? Whatever. And I had to do this with politics as well, because a lot of politics is full of so much bullcrap that's just wrong, and it's just not true. That like I literally had to unlearn a bunch of shit, because people in politics are full of shit, and the mind is full of shit. This is the deep level of the mind. This is where people talk about like, oh, there's all these deceivers out there somewhere, right? But the truth is that the biggest deceiver of them all is your own mind. You imagine you take two people who listen to the same thing, let's say the same ideology or the same whatever, and one person listens to it but doesn't take it seriously and is critical of it and is like questioning of its ideas and its assumptions and things like this, and so doesn't get deceived by it. But another person doesn't do that and just believes what the person or the group or whatever is saying, and gets caught up in something that's not true. And so people talk about like, oh, there's all these deceivers out there, but oftentimes the deceiver is you, is your own mind. This is how your mind works. And so this is why unlearning is necessary. Because your mind is the greatest deceiver of them all. There's no deceiver out there in the world. Like, I mean, there's deceivers, like there's people who lie and things like this, but like you have control over what you believe or what you think is true through looking at evidence or through looking at alternative viewpoints or whatever. Although there's definitely problems doing that as well, but that has more to do with alternative viewpoints themselves. But anyways, different episode for a different channel. Anyways, so the unlearning sounds like it would not be worth doing. And honestly, you're probably going to be very emotionally invested in what you've already learned. This is a deep problem with how the mind works. Of course, the problem is most people don't understand how the mind works. And those who kind of do only like sort of partially do, and they only take up to a certain level. And they talk about like, it's funny to me, like people in spirituality talk about the ego as if they know what it is. But I don't think they know what it is, because they talk about it as if it's only a negative thing. It's not. It's not how the ego works. It's not what the ego is. And oftentimes what they're referring to is what I'd call the underdevelopment of the ego. And that's a different episode. But this is like something that I've had to unlearn. I used to believe the same thing. Like, the ego is the problem. And like the problem is that the ego is greedy, and it's taking all these things from the world and all this stuff. But that's not completely right. That's not exactly right, because that doesn't explain what the ego is and how the ego works and this kind of thing, which is in itself another episode, or another video, whatever you want to call it. But the purpose of doing this, the purpose of unlearning things, there's a couple of reasons to do this. Actually, number one is you might actually find relief doing this, because actually a lot of times what I find is that a lot of this work, especially when you take it very seriously, is actually making you miserable. It's stressing you out more. And it's kind of counterintuitive, but that's sort of the way this seems to work. And number two is, like I said, it helps you to simplify. It helps you to kind of get more practical with your ideas, and now you're actually able to use them a lot more. So the problem is, a lot of the problems start because people mix and mesh philosophies and ideas and spiritualities, and that's fine, but it's not going to help you because a lot of them are telling you contradictory things. Like some will tell you, like, the answer is to become aware of the now. Some will tell you that the answer is like the law of attraction and like to just love everybody and like love is the solution. And some will tell you like, no, the answer is not to become aware of the now and this kind of thing. And so they'll give you like contradictory information about how to get to the now and how to do this and how to do that. And so you have to unlearn a bunch of shit. And you have to return back to basics. Once you've unlearned everything again. And so doing this, you start coming to understand some things that a lot of spiritual teachers will not tell you because either they don't know it themselves or they're just as deluded as you were or are at the current moment. Because enlightenment is not a solution. It's not necessarily going to be some like end-all, be-all thing that you think it is. And actually, really interesting to me is that there's actually some teachers who tell you that enlightenment is not what people think it is. And it's not some special moment of like oneness and all and this kind of thing. It's actually very simple. But most people who are like really spiritual are not going to realize this because they have this like need for things to be super magical and wonderful and beautiful. And it is, but it's not helping you. It's not really getting you to a place of understanding of how things actually are. And one of the things that I really was dealing with it as well, which you may also be dealing with as well, from that place, is that actually what ends up happening is you get really stuck in this beautiful magical place, and you actually something will actually happen in reality, in actuality, that is not those things, is not love, is not oneness, whatever. And you fall fast and hard. And bam, you fall to the ground and you're like overwhelmed, like, what happened to me? And like, you're even more upset kind of thing. And so, yeah, like I had to unlearn all this shit that people tell you, like, oh, the answer is just to accept everything, or the answer is to just be one with the universe, whatever that even means. Or like there is no one truth, there's only my truth and your truth and his truth. And while there's some truth in all those things, the problem is it's only like a grain of truth. And the problem too is that which part of those things is the grain? Yeah, nobody tells you that. Nobody tells you that because they're emotionally invested in this philosophy, this ideology. And those who aren't, those who are what you could call enlightened or spiritual or whatever in this way, may believe these things. And they're right, but they're only like half right. They're only like partially right. And there's a lot of other things here as well that are missing from that equation because they're attempting to get you to a place of more peace and more calm, which is good. But then from that place, you actually have to do something else. Something more than just that. But oftentimes that's like the one-dimensional thing to give you. It's like, no, it's not going to help you. And so that's why I had to unlearn a bunch of shit. So the third reason for doing this is actually you become very decluttered. Your mind is no longer cluttered. See, the problem is that when you're reading all these spiritual books and you're getting all these spiritual seminars or whatever it is that you're doing, whatever topic that you're discovering or searching for, whatever it is, what ends up happening is that your mind doesn't know what to do with all that information. And so it becomes very cluttered in this space. And you don't know how to make sense of all that information. Because it hasn't been processed in you yet. You haven't processed it. You haven't unlearned some things. You haven't given it time to work. And so give it maybe not 2 months. Maybe that's extreme. That was me, because I was really just trying to undo a lot of shit. But maybe like a couple of days, maybe like 11 days or like 2 weeks or whatever. To just going back to the basics, just going through regular life as it is. You might find that there's actually nothing wrong with life as this way at all. And that you actually might get more out of life this way. But that's not commonly understood. That's not common truth. And it's not going to be accepted by most of these people. Because they are emotionally invested in a reality that just cannot be. It will not be a thing. And that's fine if you want to be that way. I'm not going to say that you're wrong, because you're probably going off your own intuitions on this. But there probably will be a point eventually where this cannot work for you anymore, because it's only partial, or you're going to fall down hard or something along those lines. And that's fine. If that's what you want to do, I'm not going to stop you, and I'm not going to convince anybody here. None of this is for convincing anybody. This is more about, like, if you're already starting to question some things, maybe this is for you. If you're already starting to, like, come to this point where it's like, oh, this is not working for people, maybe this is for you, right? But for those who are already sure that this is the right path, and this is the only path, or the necessary path, or whatever, this is not going to be for you. This is not information that you're going to be interested in. But you might want to unlearn some things anyways, because it might help you to become a little bit more grounded in what it is. Because it is true that becoming aware of it now is important, but there is a sort of need to not just like understand that in like a philosophical or ideological way. This has to be something that you have to understand in a basic, practical, actual way, and why that is, and why that it also can be a problem, if that's what you're interested in, right? But that is uncommon. That's not something that most people are going to want to do, because it goes against the grain of the spirituality that they're engaged in. And so, when I tell you that the problem that you're dealing with is that you haven't unlearned things, they're probably not going to want to do it. It's too difficult, or they think it's too difficult, or they're too emotionally invested in this idea that they have about reality, whatever it is. But that's fine. If you are finding that this makes sense to you, and that you want to unlearn some things, maybe you don't agree with every single thing I'm saying, but maybe the unlearning part makes sense. What's necessary is to take like a few days away from this and just do normal things like you normally do, but just go back to the basics of life. Eat, sleep, go to work, things like this. And don't focus on the self-help stuff, or if you do, it should be very limited in scope. Maybe some meditation. I didn't even really do that because I was so deeply involved in learning, but maybe some meditation, as long as you're not like thinking about it too much in your mind about like, oh, this is to help me to become more one or whatever. And come back in like a week or two, and then you can start to, and then what you do from that place is actually start to work through what you've already learned or what you think you've learned and see what's there now. Because the problem oftentimes is a lot of this is very unprocessed for you, and so you don't know it's actually true. This is why oftentimes people tell you like, oh, there is no truth. There's just like my truth and your truth, and because they don't know what's true for themselves, oftentimes. In this way, they don't know. They can't see past the perspectives that they've been getting from this work that they're doing, and so doing this, you're actually going to become more aware of your own levels here, and it's going to be a lot more practical and actual in this kind of thing. So when you start learning again, when you start back up again, you start with the basics, right? You start going over like what you remember, and you don't like go right into the deep end of this and just go into the basics, like, oh, and this seemed to be true and this seemed to be true, and then work from there and just keep at the basics for a while, and then slowly over time, if you want to, just build that back up again, because what that's going to do is it's going to help you stay grounded. Because the problem is oftentimes what I find is that people are doing all this spiritual surfacing, the spiritual searching, but they're not grounded because they haven't done it. They haven't done this, and they haven't stuck to the basics first, and then kind of moved up from there. That's the problem oftentimes. And when you feel yourself becoming overwhelmed with it, or it feels like there's a lot more thoughts than there was, go back to the basics again. I kind of stuck to the basics for the most part because I find it's actually more useful. The more simple, in some ways, the more simple a technique is, the more useful it's going to be. The more complex your spiritual work is, the more it's not going to work for you in a lot of ways, I find. That doesn't mean that it's going to be one-dimensional. It's still going to be, there's going to be a lot of facets, but it's going to be very basic how you use those facets, and how many facets are going to be very small, probably like maybe 3 or 4 or 5. So, yeah. It is what it is. Hope everybody enjoys this, and I'll talk to you in the next one.